The Belgian Malinois weighed 90 pounds of pure muscle and rage, and he was standing on a dead man's chest. That was the first thing Nurse Nora Voss saw when she pushed through the trauma bay doors at Hargrove Military Medical Center. Not the blood, not the crash equipment scattered across the floor, not the 12 people frozen against the walls. Just the dog. Massive. Still. Trembling with something that wasn't fear. A police sniper had his rifle trained through the exterior window. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And somewhere beneath that animal's paws, a Navy SEAL's heart had already stopped. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. Real emotions, real stakes, fictional worlds that feel like they could be true. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one will take everything you've got. The emergency call had come in at 4:47 in the morning. A military helicopter had gone down 12 miles east of Hargrove, Oregon, in a stretch of dense forest where the tree line met a rock ridge and the wind did unpredictable things to aircraft. Search and rescue had reached the wreckage in 40 minutes. They'd pulled 2 people out, one dead on scene, one barely breathing, and one Belgian Malinois who had refused to leave the breathing one's side even as the fuselage burned. By the time the ambulance backed into the Hargrove Military Medical Center bay, the dog had been in contact with the patient for over an hour. The paramedics hadn't been able to get close enough for a full assessment. One of them had a bite mark on his forearm that he kept pressing against his shirt. The patient was Master Chief Jonas Reel, 38, Special Operations Classified Unit. His canine partner was tagged in the system as Axel, 100% Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, decorated in 2 combat deployments. The trauma team had prepared for the SEAL. Nobody had prepared for the dog. Nora Voss was 26 years old and had been working at Hargrove for 4 months. She'd come in on an overnight shift to cover for a colleague who'd called out sick, which meant she was the most junior person in the building when the call came through. She'd been restocking supply carts in the hallway when the automatic doors blew open and the gurney came through fast, paramedics shouting over each other. She stepped back against the wall. Standard protocol. Get out of the way. Let the trauma team handle it. Then she heard the dog. Not a bark, not a growl. Something lower and more continuous, like the sound an engine makes before it fails. A vibration you feel in your sternum before you process it as sound. She followed the sound to the trauma bay entrance and looked through the small reinforced window in the door. Axel stood on the patient's chest with his forelegs, his body angled sideways across Jonas Reel's torso, his head moving in slow arcs to track every person in the room. The trauma team, 5 of them, had pressed themselves against the equipment cabinets and monitoring stations. One nurse had her back flat against the far wall, arms raised slightly in the unconscious gesture of someone who doesn't want to make anything worse. Dr. Patterson Webb, the attending on call, stood closest to the gurney with a laryngoscope in his hand, not moving. Animal control is 12 minutes out, someone said quietly. He's going to die in 12 minutes, Webb said, just as quietly. Nora watched Axel's head swing toward a respiratory technician who had shifted her weight, and the growl deepened into something with edges. The tech went still immediately. The problem wasn't that the dog was violent. Nora had seen violent dogs. Violent dogs lunged, bit, retreated, bit again. This dog was doing something else. I was holding position with a precision that looked almost deliberate. Every time someone moved, he tracked them. Every time someone froze, he settled slightly. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was managing the room. She knew this because she had spent 3 years managing rooms exactly like this. Not hospital rooms. Rooms in places that didn't have names on maps. She didn't think about that anymore. That was the agreement she'd made with herself when she'd left. But she kept watching Axel. She'd heard the sound twice before, that specific register of vocalization, that particular body posture, and both times it had meant the same thing. The dog wasn't guarding a body. He was keeping something alive by sheer insistence. She pushed the door open 2 inches. "Close that," Webb said without looking up. "He's not attacking," she said. "Close the door." She closed it. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the frame and watched through the window as the seconds ticked away and nobody moved, and Jonas Reel lay perfectly still beneath the animal that refused to leave him. Then she saw the sniper. He was outside the window on the east wall, positioned on the roof of the covered ambulance dock, prone, rifle settled. She could see the shape of him through the exterior glass, the flat silhouette, the barrel angled slightly downward toward the trauma bay interior. Someone had called for a shot. She had maybe 4 minutes, maybe less. She turned around and walked to the supply room at the end of the hall. She needed a moment to think, and she needed something specific from the cabinet in the back corner. The supply room was cold and smelled like antiseptic and rubber. She pulled open the cabinet and went through the contents quickly. Gauze, tourniquets, saline bags. She wasn't looking for any of those things. She was looking at her own left forearm, thinking about what was underneath her sleeve. She rolled the fabric up to her elbow. The tattoo was old, 6 years. The ink had settled into something subtle and permanent, the way old tattoos do, faded slightly but still precise. A dog's head rendered in clean lines with a 4-digit unit code beneath it, in a font the military had stopped using. The insignia of a classification program that technically didn't exist in any public record. She hadn't shown anyone at Hargrove. She hadn't mentioned the program. She'd been careful about that, the same way she'd been careful about everything since she'd separated from service. She rolled her sleeve back down. Then she went to find Supervisor Keene. Margaret Keene was the charge nurse for the overnight shift, a woman in her 50s with a precision haircut and the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending decades in high-pressure environments without breaking. She was standing outside the trauma bay with her tablet, watching through the window. "I need to go in," Nora said. Keene looked at her. "You're not on the trauma team." "I know." "Webb has it." "Webb can't move. Nobody in there can move. The dog has them pinned." Keene kept looking at her. "And you think you can do what exactly?" Nora hesitated. She was very deliberate about what she said next. "I have some experience with military working dogs. Some experience. I think I can get him off the patient." Keene was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Webb had managed to take a single step toward the gurney. Axel's posture shifted immediately, his weight redistributing across his forelegs, the growl dropping into a register that made the hair on Nora's arms raise even through the door. Webb stepped back. "You'd be going in with no backup," Keene said. "I know. If he attacks you, he won't." Keene studied her for another 3 seconds. Then she turned away from the window. "I can't authorize this. I'm not asking for authorization. I'm telling you what I'm going to do." "Boss," Keene's voice had an edge. "You're a floor nurse. You've been here 4 months. You don't have the authority or the training to—" "You're right," Nora said. "I don't have the authority." She went back to the trauma bay door. Through the window, she could see the sniper had adjusted his angle. He was compensating for the glass refraction, she realized. He was getting ready to take the shot. She thought about the 6 months she'd spent in a program that had no official name, learning to read animals that had been trained to be extensions of human intent. She thought about what the program director had told them on the first day. These dogs don't have owners, they have partners. The difference matters. She put her hand on the door. "Voss." Webb's voice came through the door's speaker system. The trauma bay had an intercom. He'd seen her through the window. "Do not come in here. That's a direct order from the attending physician." She opened the door anyway. The sound hit her first. The dog's vocalization was much louder inside the room, and it was more complex than it had seemed through the door, layered frequencies that her body registered as threat before her brain caught up. She felt her pulse jump. She breathed through it. She did not look at Axel directly. Not yet. She looked at Jonas Reel instead. He was in bad shape. His face was deeply lacerated on the left side, his neck brace in place, IV line in his right arm at an odd angle that suggested someone had placed it under duress. His chest was still. She couldn't tell from here whether he was breathing or not. Axel's body was covering too much of his torso. "Get out," Webb said. His voice was controlled but tightly controlled, which was different. "I'll get the dog off him," she said. She kept her voice flat and even. "Give me 2 minutes. You'll get yourself killed. That's my risk to take." Axel tracked her the moment she spoke. She felt his attention like pressure, the full weight of 7 years of training and 300 pounds of territorial instinct focused entirely on the new variable that had entered his space. She stopped moving. She let him look at her. In her peripheral vision, she could see the trauma team still pressed against the walls, could see Webb with the laryngoscope in his hand, could see the monitor cart with its dark screens because nobody had been able to get close enough to connect leads. Axel growled. She stood there. She had done this before. She had learned to hold still against every reflex that wanted her to move or speak or fill the silence with something, because these animals read your energy before they read your action, and if your energy said, "I'm afraid of you," that information arrived before any command you gave. She wasn't afraid. She was something else. Careful, focused, present in a way she hadn't been in years. Axel's growl changed. It didn't stop, but it shifted in pitch, the way a question is different from a statement. His head tilted a fraction. She turned her left arm over, slowly, and pushed the sleeve up. The room was very quiet. Axel went still. Not the stillness of a threat, the stillness of recognition. She'd seen it before. The moment an animal registers something outside the current situation, something that connects to a different context, a different time. He was reading her tattoo. Specifically, he was reading the unit insignia, because these dogs were trained to respond to visual markers from their handler's unit. And whoever had trained Axel, whoever had built the behavioral architecture that was currently running in that animal's brain, had come from the same program she had. She had maybe 30 seconds before his assessment resolved one way or the other. She kept her arm extended. She said quietly, in a register that was nothing like a command and nothing like a plea, something in between, the tone the program called anchor voice, the voice that meant, "You know me, you've always known me. Nothing here has changed. Axel, Overwatch off." The dog looked at her. His forelegs shifted. His weight came off Jonas Riel's chest with a precision that didn't disturb a single piece of equipment, and he stepped sideways off the gurney in one clean movement, hit the floor, and walked straight to Nora. He pressed his massive head against her thigh. Nobody in the room moved. Nora put her hand on the back of his neck and held him there. "Leads," she said. She was looking at Webb. "Get the leads on him now." Webb stared at her for another full second. Then he moved to the gurney. The trauma team came unstuck from the walls. Equipment started coming online. The respiratory tech got close enough to check Riel's airway. Nora stood with her hand on Axel's neck and her sleeve still rolled up and the tattoo still visible. And she felt the dog trembling against her. Not the trembling of fear or aggression, but the particular vibration of an animal that has been holding an impossible position for too long and has finally found someone to hand it off to. "Good boy," she said quietly. "I've got him now." The monitor cart chirped as the first lead connected. Webb looked at the screen. Something crossed his face. Then Axel barked. Once, sharp and specific, aimed at the gurney. Nora's hand tightened on his neck. She knew that bark. She knew it the way she knew the difference between arterial and venous pressure by touch, not from training precisely, but from 3 years of high-stakes repetition that had carved the knowledge somewhere below conscious thought. She stepped to the gurney. She pressed 2 fingers to Jonas Riel's neck, found nothing, moved them half an inch, pressed again. "Stethoscope," she said. Someone handed her one. She placed it and listened. The room waited. Then she heard it. One beat. A pause so long she almost stopped believing. Then another. She pulled the stethoscope out and looked at Webb. "He's alive." Webb grabbed the stethoscope and listened himself. His eyes changed. "Code Blue," he said. His voice came out louder than he'd meant it to. "Code Blue, he's alive. Somebody get me the crash cart now." The room exploded. Nora stepped back to give them space and kept her hand on Axel's collar as the trauma team moved with a sudden controlled urgency that transformed the frozen tableau of 3 minutes ago into something that looked like choreography. Webb was calling orders. Someone was cutting Riel's flight suit. The respiratory tech was working his airway. Axel watched it all from beside Nora's leg, his attention total, his body leaning against her with a steadiness that felt less like dependency and more like acknowledgement. The sniper outside had lowered his rifle. Through the door's window, Nora could see Keen standing in the hallway, watching. Their eyes met briefly. Keen's expression was unreadable in the specific way that meant she was filing a great deal of information away for later. Nora looked away. She had made a calculation when she'd rolled up her sleeve. She'd known what it would cost. She'd built a careful, small, unremarkable life at Hargrove in 4 months. And she'd known the moment she walked through that door with her arm extended that the life would get more complicated. She had walked in anyway. Because Jonas Riel was alive, and Axel had known it before any monitor in the hospital did. and the sniper had been 30 seconds from making both of those facts irrelevant. Behind her, Webb said, "I've got a pulse. I've got a pulse. Somebody tell me his pressure." Axel exhaled against her leg. "Yeah," she said quietly. To the dog, to herself, to the 4 months of careful anonymity she was watching dissolve through the trauma bay window. "I know." Webb's voice carried over the noise of the team working. "Who is she?" he asked someone. He wasn't looking at Nora. He was asking about the nurse who had walked into a locked room with a military attack dog and said 2 words that had stopped everything. Nobody in the room had an answer. The monitor beeped steadily now. Jonas Reel's heart was doing something it hadn't been doing 12 minutes ago, sustaining itself. Irregular, fragile, but real. Axel pressed harder against Nora's leg. Outside, the sky over Hargrove was going from black to the color of old ash, the particular gray that comes before dawn in a city that sits too close to the coast, the kind of light that makes everything look like it happened already, like the morning is just catching up to events that have moved on without it. Inside the trauma bay, someone finally got a blood pressure reading. Webb stared at the number. Then he looked at Reel. Then he looked at Nora with something in his eyes she recognized. Not gratitude exactly. The thing that comes before gratitude. The thing that asks, what did I almost let happen here? She didn't say anything. She just stood there with the dog and waited for the next thing to go wrong. Because in her experience, there was always a next thing. And something about the way Axel kept his body angled toward the trauma bay door, watching it, tracking it, not the patient, not the staff, but the door, told her the next thing was already on its way. The door was the thing Axel kept watching, not Jonas Reel, who was now surrounded by 4 people working with the specific focused urgency of a team that had nearly lost a patient and knew it. Not Nora, who had become something like an anchor point for the dog in the past 20 minutes. Not the equipment, not the noise, not the controlled chaos of a trauma resuscitation in progress. The door. Nora noticed it during the 3rd time Webb called for a pressure reading. She was standing against the west wall to keep out of the way, one hand still resting on Axel's collar, and she watched the dog's attention track to the door every 15 to 20 seconds with a regularity that wasn't anxiety. It was surveillance. There was a difference, and she knew it, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't fully name yet. She filed it away and watched the team work. Jonas Reel's numbers were still unstable. His blood pressure was reading in ranges that suggested internal bleeding the imaging hadn't fully mapped, and his heart rhythm was doing something erratic on the lower end that Webb kept calling benign, and that the charge nurse on the trauma team kept watching with an expression that said she wasn't sure she agreed. His left tibia was fractured in 2 places. 3 ribs. A concussion severe enough that even if everything else resolved, the neurological picture was going to be complicated for weeks. He was alive. That was what mattered for right now. At 6:12 in the morning, they moved him to the trauma ICU, which was on the 3rd floor and had better imaging access and a surgical suite 2 doors down. The process of moving him took 11 minutes and involved Axel, which created a secondary logistical crisis that Nora navigated by simply staying beside the dog and not asking anyone's permission. Webb noticed. He didn't say anything. Keene noticed too. She fell into step beside Nora as the gurney cleared the elevator. "I need to know who you are," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that only Nora could hear her. "You have my file," Nora said. "I have your application file. That's not what I mean." Nora kept her eyes on Axel. "I know what you mean." "That tattoo is old." Keene was quiet for a moment. The gurney turned the corner into the ICU corridor. "We're going to have a conversation," she said. "Not today, but soon." "I know," Nora said. Keene stopped walking and let the rest of the team move ahead. Nora stayed with Axel and followed the gurney to Jonas Reel's room. They got him settled. They got him connected to monitoring. They got him as stable as he was going to be for the next few hours, which was more stable than he'd been 40 minutes ago, which was something. The night shift surgeon came in, looked at the imaging, and made a list of things that needed to happen in the next 6 hours in order of priority. Nora stood at the back of the room and listened and thought about the way Axel had looked at the door. By 7:30, the day shift had started arriving. The day shift at Hargrove Military Medical Center ran differently from the overnight. More staff, more administrators, more of the institutional weight that accumulates in any facility that serves both active military and civilian populations. There were protocols. There were chains of command. There were people whose job was specifically to manage situations that had gone outside established protocol, and those people reported to other people. And all of that machinery was already grinding into motion by the time the sun came fully up over the Oregon coast. Nora knew it was coming. She'd been in institutions long enough to recognize the sound. It arrived in the form of Dr. Harrison Polk at 8:04 a.m. Polk was the chief of emergency medicine, which meant he had authority over everything that had happened in the trauma bay and immediate grounds to review her conduct. He was 61 years old and had the particular bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades being the most senior person in every room he entered. He walked into the ICU corridor with a tablet in his hand and a resident behind him carrying a secondary file, and he looked at Nora the way people look at something that has appeared in a place it shouldn't be. "Voss," he said. He had read her name tag. "You're floor nursing, overnight, 3rd rotation." "Yes." "You entered a secured trauma bay against the attending physician's direct verbal instruction." The patient was, "I'm not asking a question." He looked at the tablet. "You also appear to have represented yourself as having specialized training with military working dogs. Is that accurate?" She had not represented anything, technically. She had said she had some experience, which was true, in the same way that saying the Pacific Ocean had some water in it was true. But she understood the framing. "I have experience with military K-9 behavioral assessment," she said. "Through what program? What unit?" "I'm not able to share that information." Polk looked up from the tablet. His expression shifted in a way that said this answer had confirmed something he'd already suspected, and that the confirmation had not improved his opinion of her. "You're not able to," he repeated. "No, because it's classified." She didn't answer. He studied her for a moment. Behind him, the resident looked uncomfortable, which was the correct response to the situation. "Here's what I can see from your file," Polk said. "You have a nursing degree from a state program, 3 years of work history, 2 of which are listed as federal agency medical support, which is not a specific enough description to verify, and 4 months here. That's what's on paper." He closed the tablet cover. "What's not on paper concerns me." "I did my job," Nora said. "The patient is alive." "The patient is alive," Polk agreed, "and a military K-9 that should have been neutralized is currently in an ICU room, which is a sanitation and liability issue we don't have a protocol for. And a nurse with a classified background and an unverified skill set is standing in a secure medical unit at the end of a shift she wasn't scheduled to work. So you can understand why I have questions." "I understand," she said. "I also understand that Jonas Reel has a heartbeat right now that he wouldn't have without that dog. And the dog wasn't going to stand down for anyone in that room except someone he recognized." "And he recognized you?" "Yes." "Why?" She held his gaze. "I can't tell you that." Polk was quiet. In the room behind her, she could hear the monitors running. She could hear Axel's breathing, steady, still watchful. "You're suspended from patient contact pending review," Polk said. "Effective immediately. Do not enter any patient room. Do not interact with staff in a clinical capacity. You'll be contacted by HR." She'd expected something like this. She nodded. "The dog needs to be transferred to animal control within the hour. I'll have someone coordinate with, he won't go." "Excuse me?" "Axel won't leave the patient. If you force it, he'll become a threat again. The team that handled him initially will tell you the same thing." Polk's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have him sedated." "You can try," she said. "But military working dogs in protective mode have a specific stress response to sedation attempts that makes the procedure significantly more dangerous than Voss." His voice had an edge now. "You are suspended from clinical duty. That means I am not asking for your assessment." She stopped. She understood the line. She had pushed up to it, and she didn't cross it, because crossing it would give him a cleaner reason to remove her permanently, and she wasn't ready to be removed permanently. Not yet. Not while she still didn't know what Axel had been watching at that door. "Yes, sir," she said. She stepped back. She stood in the corridor while Polk and his resident moved away, and she breathed steadily, and she did not look at the door to Reel's room. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor instead. The sun was fully up now. The morning had the bright, flat quality of early light off coastal overcast, the kind that doesn't warm anything. Below, in the hospital parking lot, she could see 2 vehicles that hadn't been there at dawn. One was a dark SUV with government plates that she clocked from 3 floors up without consciously choosing to clock it. The other was a civilian truck that had backed into its space, a minor detail that most people would not notice, and that she noticed the way Axel had been watching the door. Old training didn't switch off. It went dormant. There was a difference. She stood at the window for 2 more minutes. Then she went to the staff break room on the 3rd floor and sat down with a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want and thought about the next 12 hours. She needed to know who was in the SUV. She needed to know what was on Jonas Riel's person or in his tactical gear, because Axel's behavior had never been purely about the man. There was something else driving the protection response, something she hadn't had time to identify yet. And she needed to know who had called for the sniper, because that decision had come very fast, faster than standard protocol, in a situation that was unusual but not immediately life-threatening. And fast decisions in ambiguous situations usually had reasons that weren't in the incident report. She drank the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. At 9:15, Keen found her. Keen sat across the table without preamble and put her own cup down. She was still in her overnight supervisor's badge. She'd been here since before Nora had come in, and she showed it slightly, not in any obvious way, just in the particular efficiency of her movements that comes when someone is conserving energy because they don't know how much longer the day will run. Polk suspended you, Keen said. Yes. From patient contact. Yes. Keen wrapped both hands around her cup. The military liaison officer is here, Colonel Diane Ferris. She arrived 20 minutes ago with 2 people who aren't in uniform and didn't introduce themselves. Nora was still. What does she want? She wants access to Riel, and she wants to know who authorized a civilian nurse to enter the trauma bay and interact with a classified military asset. Keen paused. Those are her words. Classified military asset. She means Axel. I assume so. Keen looked at her directly. Nora, if there are things in your background that are going to become relevant in the next few hours, I would rather know about them from you than from Colonel Ferris. It was a fair ask. Keen was a fair person. Nora had assessed that within her first week, and 4 months had confirmed it. She was the kind of supervisor who covered her people when coverage was warranted and held them accountable when it wasn't, which was rarer than it should have been in institutional medicine. There are things I can't tell you, Nora said, not because I'm hiding them from you specifically, because they're genuinely not mine to share. Classified. Yes. Keen absorbed that. Are you in trouble? I don't know yet. Is the patient in trouble? Nora thought about the SUV in the parking lot. She thought about how fast the sniper call had come. She thought about Axel and the door. Potentially, she said. Keen set her cup down. I covered for you with Polk. I told him you'd shown good clinical judgment in an emergency situation. I'm not sure it made a difference, but I said it. Thank you. Don't thank me, just... She stopped, looked at her cup. Whatever this is, be careful with it. I will. Keen got up and left. Nora stayed at the table for another 3 minutes. Then she went back to the 3rd-floor corridor. She was not technically in patient rooms. She was in the corridor. She stood near the window and did not enter any patient room and was therefore not in violation of Polk's suspension in any specific way she could be formally cited for. She watched the door to Riel's room. Colonel Ferris arrived on this floor at 9:47. She was 50-something, composed in the way career military officers are composed. Not rigid, but organized from the inside out, every element of presentation intentional. She had 2 people with her. One was in uniform, a captain by his insignia. The other 2 were in civilian clothes, and they had the quality that certain people have of being slightly more present than the space they occupy, which was a thing Nora had learned to notice a long time ago in a context she didn't revisit often. Ferris stopped in the corridor and looked at Nora. You're Voss, she said. Yes, ma'am. You entered the trauma bay at approximately 0511 this morning and interacted with a restricted military K-9 using classified handling protocols. I de-escalated an emergency situation, Nora said, using classified handling protocols. Using what I knew. Ferris studied her with the particular attention of someone who had spent a career reading people in environments where misreading them had real consequences. Where did you serve? I'm not able to discuss that. Because of classification. Yes. Ferris glanced at the 2 non-uniformed individuals, some brief exchange of information, in that look that Nora couldn't fully read. Then she looked back at Nora. I'm going to need you to wait in a designated room while we conduct our assessment. You're not under arrest, but you're also not free to move through this facility until I understand who I'm talking to. I've already been suspended from clinical duty, Nora said. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm not concerned about obstruction. I'm concerned about access. Ferris's voice was even and informational, not hostile. You have knowledge of classified handling protocols for a specific K9 unit. That knowledge has a limited and documented source pool. I need to establish where you sit in that pool before I can assess the current situation. Nora understood the logic. She even agreed with it in the abstract. She also understood that being put in a room and held there while Ferris assessed the situation would mean she couldn't watch the door to Real's room, and that Axel's surveillance of that door had not been idle behavior. I'll wait, she said, but I need 5 minutes first. Ferris's expression didn't change. For what? I need to check on the K9. If he's been alone in there since the team settled the patient, his stress levels will be, my people can assess the K9. Your people couldn't get close to him 3 hours ago, Nora said. And if he goes into active protective mode again with your team trying to access the patient, someone's going to get hurt. It was a calculated argument, and Ferris knew it was calculated. And for a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other in the corridor with the monitors beeping behind the door and the flat morning light coming through the window. 2 minutes, Ferris said. Nora went into the room. Axel was at the foot of the bed. He'd moved from the floor position she'd last seen him in. He was standing now, fully alert, his attention split between the door and the bed. He acknowledged Nora with a shift of his weight, but didn't relax entirely, which told her his stress level was elevated. She looked at Jonas Reel. He was sedated. His numbers were better than they'd been. The left side of his face was covered in surgical dressing from the lacerations. His hands were at his sides, the right one still with the IV line, the left one resting slightly open. She looked at his tactical harness, which had been removed and folded on the chair against the wall. Standard procedure. She looked at Axel. The dog was watching the harness. Not the patient. The harness. Her eyes went back to it. Military tactical harnesses for K9 units had standardized attachment points. She had handled enough of them to know the configuration by touch. There were the standard ones, lead attachment, identification tag, medical alert panel, and there were the non-standard ones, the modifications that got added for specific operations, the additions that didn't appear in any general inventory. She couldn't search the harness. Not with Ferris outside and 2 non-uniformed intelligence personnel in the corridor who were there specifically, because something about this situation had flagged as sensitive enough to require their presence. But she noticed the harness, and she noticed that Axel noticed she'd noticed. He held her gaze for 2 seconds in that particular way these dogs communicated across the language barrier. Not anthropomorphization, just learned recognition of intent. He had been trained to protect something. He had been protecting the patient, yes, but the harness had been with the patient, and now the harness was across the room, and he was still watching it. Okay, she said quietly. To herself, to the dog, to no one. She looked at Real's face. Even sedated, even this damaged, there was something in the set of his features that she placed. Not individual recognition, because she had never met this man before this morning. Something structural. The particular compression around the eyes and mouth that people carry when they have been a long time in conditions that don't allow for the kind of rest that fully restores a person. She knew that compression. She saw it in the mirror occasionally when she was too tired to avoid it. I've got you, she said, to him or to Axel, or to the general proposition of keeping things alive that should stay alive. Hang on. She went back to the corridor. She spent the next 4 hours in a consultation room on the 2nd floor that had a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked at an interior courtyard. She had her phone. She was not technically detained. She was waiting. Ferris came in at 11:30, sat across from her, and conducted what was technically a conversation and was actually a structured elicitation. Nora had been on the other side of structured elicitations before. She knew the shape of them, the warm opening, the gradual narrowing of focus, the moments where a casual rephrase was actually a test of consistency. She answered what she could answer and declined what she couldn't, and kept her answers short enough that there was no useful inconsistency to find. What she wanted to know, and could not ask, was why Ferris's two non-uniform personnel had not introduced themselves. Standard protocol in a military liaison situation was for all parties to be identified, even vaguely. The fact that two people had accompanied the colonel without any identification at all meant either they outranked the situation's official classification level, or they were operating under a mandate that made their presence in the official record undesirable. Neither option was comfortable. Ferris concluded the elicitation at 12:45. She was professionally neutral throughout. She thanked Nora for her time. She did not indicate when or whether Nora would be permitted to resume normal movement through the facility. At 1:15, Nora's phone buzzed. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. It contained 4 words and a room number. "He's asking for you." She read it twice. She looked at the window. She thought about the consultation room and Ferris and the tactical harness on the chair in Real's ICU room. She got up. She was suspended from patient contact. She was currently in a quasi-voluntary holding pattern at the request of a colonel with unclear authority over her movements. She was the most junior clinical staff member involved in this situation, and she had been dismissed, suspended, and set aside by 3 separate people in authority in the past 6 hours. She went to the 3rd floor anyway. The corridor outside Real's room was different than it had been. There was a uniformed soldier at the door now, a young staff sergeant who had the look of someone given a post he had not been fully briefed on. He put a hand up when she approached. "Restricted access," he said. "I was called," she said. "By who?" She showed him the message. He looked at it. He looked at her ID badge. He looked uncomfortable with the gap between his orders and the current situation, which was a reasonable response. "Wait here," he said. He turned and knocked on the door and opened it 6 inches and exchanged words with someone inside that Nora couldn't hear. Then he stepped back and let her in. Jonas Reel was awake, partially. His eyes were open to maybe 70%, the sedation still present but thinning at the edges. The left side of his face was still fully bandaged. He was tracking the room slowly, the way people do when they're working against chemical weight to come back to clarity. Axel had moved to the side of the bed and was standing with his chin on the mattress beside Real's left hand. Real's eyes found Nora when she came in. They stayed on her with a focus that was sharper than the rest of him suggested. "You're the nurse," he said. His voice was rough, compressed. "Yes." "Axel." He blinked. Looked at the dog for a moment, something crossing his face that she didn't try to read, then back at her. "He let you in?" "Yes." "Why?" She showed him her left forearm. He looked at the tattoo. Something in his expression changed. Not surprise exactly. Recognition of a specific kind. "That program hasn't existed for 3 years, he said. "No," she agreed. He absorbed that. His right hand moved toward the IV line in a way that suggested he'd been about to do something and then thought better of it. He looked at the harness on the chair. "Don't let them take it," he said. His voice had dropped. It was not a request. It was the specific register of someone delivering information they believe is critical and may not have many more opportunities to deliver. "The harness," she said. What's in the side pocket?" His eyes were tracking toward the door now, the same direction Axel had been watching all morning. "There's a card. Micro SD. If the wrong people find it before—" The door opened. One of the non-uniformed personnel from Ferris's team stood in the doorway. He was looking at Nora with an expression that had nothing of neutrality in it. "You're not authorized to be in this room," he said. Axel rose from the mattress. The man's eyes went to the dog. Axel did not growl. He simply stood, and the quality of his attention on the man in the doorway was very specific, and the man in the doorway understood what he was looking at. Jonas Reel's hand found Axel's collar. "She stays," Reel said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. The man in the doorway looked at Nora, at Reel, at Axel. "Colonel Ferris needs a—" "She stays," Reel said again. 3 seconds of very charged silence. Then the man stepped back and closed the door. Nora stood in the room with the patient and the dog and the harness on the chair, and she thought about the micro SD card in the side pocket, and she thought about 2 non-uniformed personnel who hadn't introduced themselves, and she thought about how fast the sniper call had come that morning. She thought about the way Axel had been watching the door. She turned to look at the harness. Then the door opened again, and this time it wasn't the non-uniformed man. It was the other one. He had a syringe in his hand, and he was already moving toward the bed. Nora moved before she finished processing what she was seeing. Not thought, not decision, just the body doing what years of training had burned into it below the level of conscious choice. She stepped left, putting herself between the man and the bed, and her right hand came up and caught his wrist 2 inches before the syringe reached her. He was strong. He had the kind of strength that comes from regular physical conditioning, the functional kind, not the gym kind. He torqued against her grip immediately and nearly broke it. She torqued back and drove her elbow into the inside of his forearm. The syringe dropped. Axel was already moving, not at the man, not yet, because Reel hadn't given the command and the dog was still operating on protocol even now, but he had positioned himself at the foot of the bed with his weight forward and his attention absolute. The man pulled back from Nora and reached inside his jacket. "Don't," she said. He looked at her, at Axel, at the syringe on the floor between them. He was recalculating. She could see it, the specific internal arithmetic of someone who had entered a situation with a plan and was now running the numbers on a plan that had already failed its first step. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said. "I know what's in that syringe," she said. She didn't, specifically, but she knew what category of thing it was, and she knew what it would have done to a man whose cardiovascular system was already operating at the edge of its capacity. He looked at the door. "Don't," she said again. He went for the door anyway. She let him go. Not because she couldn't have stopped him. She might have been able to, she might not. But because stopping him physically in a hospital ICU with a sedated patient 3 feet away and a military K-9 at threat threshold was a calculation with too many bad outcomes on too many branches. She let him go, and she picked up the syringe from the floor carefully, 2 fingers on the plunger cap, and she put it in the Sharps disposal on the wall because that was the safest immediate location. And then she turned to Jonas Reel. He was watching her with eyes that were more focused than they'd been 2 minutes ago. Adrenaline did that, burned through sedation faster than the pharmacology predicted. "The harness," he said. She was already at the chair. The tactical harness was standard military K-9 issue with 2 non-standard modifications she'd clocked from across the room but hadn't wanted to examine while the other man was present. The first modification was a reinforced panel on the left side. The second was a small secondary pocket on the right, low, with a magnetic closure instead of the standard snap. She opened it. Inside was a micro SD card in a waterproof casing no larger than her thumbnail, and a folded piece of paper that had been wet at some point and dried into a slightly warped rectangle. "Take it," Reel said. She took it. Both pieces. She put them in the inner pocket of her scrub top against her sternum. "Who was he?" she asked. She was already moving back toward the bed, watching the door. "His name is Garrett Meade," Reel said. "He's been in the room twice since I woke up, both times asking about the harness." "He's with Ferris?" "He came with her. That doesn't mean he's with her." Reel's voice was still compressed, but his thinking was clear. She could hear it. "There's a difference." She understood the distinction. People could travel together and serve entirely separate functions. She'd done it herself more than once. "There's a second man," she said. "Vickers. Same situation." She looked at the door. Meade had gone through it less than 90 seconds ago and hadn't come back, which meant he was either getting help or reassessing or both. "I need to get this card to someone," she said. "Who do I contact?" Reel blinked. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite pain. It was the expression of someone who has been running an operation alone for long enough that being asked who they trust requires actual thought. "There's a warrant officer," he said. "Name's Delia Oakes. She's OSI. If she's still—" He stopped. She was running a parallel investigation. If Meade and Vickers are here, she may not be reachable. "OSI," Nora said. Office of Special Investigations. She knew the organization. She had interacted with it exactly once, years ago, and that interaction had been one of the primary reasons she'd decided to build a quiet, unremarkable life in a small Oregon hospital. "Try her anyway," Reel said. "The number's in my phone." He gestured with 2 fingers toward the bedside table. "Left contact, initials DO. Don't say my name when she picks up." Nora looked at this phone. She looked at the door. "Axel," Reel said. The dog turned to him. "Stay with her." Axel looked at Nora. Nora picked up Reel's phone. The door opened. It was the staff sergeant from the corridor, and behind him was Colonel Ferris, and behind Ferris was Garrett Meade, and Meade's expression had resolved out of the recalculation phase and into something harder and simpler. Ferris took in the room in 2 seconds. Nora at the bedside with the phone, Axel between Nora and the door, the tactical harness on the chair with its secondary pocket open and empty. "Where is it?" Ferris said. The question was directed at Nora, but it wasn't really a question. "Where's what?" Nora said. Ferris looked at Meade. Meade looked at Nora in a way that told her he had revised his plan, and the revision was not better for her. Reel spoke from the bed, his voice deliberate and carrying. "Colonel Ferris, I want to formally document that an individual traveling with your party entered this room approximately 4 minutes ago with a syringe containing an unidentified substance and attempted to administer it to me without my consent or any documented clinical authorization." Ferris went very still. She looked at Meade. Meade's expression didn't change. "That's a serious allegation, Master Chief," Ferris said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something moving underneath it. "I know what it is," Reel said. "I also know there's a sharps disposal on that wall with a capped syringe in it that wasn't there before this individual entered the room. I'd recommend having it tested before anyone handles it further." The staff sergeant at the door looked at the sharps disposal. He looked at Meade. He was a young man in a confusing situation, and he was doing the thing young soldiers in confusing situations sometimes did correctly, which was to stop moving and wait for clarity. Ferris turned to Meade. The look between them lasted 3 seconds and contained a conversation that Nora could not fully decode, but whose general shape was legible. "You did something without my authorization, and I am now in a room with evidence of it. Step out," Ferris said. "Colonel?" "That's an order, Garrett." Meade stepped out. The staff sergeant, wisely, stayed in the room. Ferris turned back to Nora. Her composure had returned to its full operational level, which told Nora something about what kind of soldier she was. Not the kind who came apart when a situation shifted, but the kind who recalculated fast and moved forward on the new number. "The card," Ferris said. Her voice was quiet enough that it didn't carry to the hallway. "I'm going to ask you to hand it over. Not because of Meade, because the intelligence on that card has a classification level that makes it a significant liability for anyone without the appropriate clearance holding it." "What classification?" Nora asked. Ferris looked at her steadily. "You don't have access to that information. Then you understand why I might not feel entirely comfortable handing it to you. I'm a colonel in the United States military, Miss Voss." "I know what you are," Nora said, "and I know that the 2 men who came with you aren't in uniform, aren't identified, and one of them just tried to put something in an IV line. So I'm going to need more than your rank before I make any decisions." A long moment. Reel was watching Ferris from the bed with the focused patience of a man who was in pain and running low on resources but not on attention. Ferris made a decision. Nora could see her make it, the slight shift in posture, the recalibration. "Sergeant Holloway," she said, addressing the staff sergeant, "you're dismissed. Ma'am, my post. I'll take responsibility for the post." Holloway looked at Reel, who gave him a slight nod. The sergeant left and pulled the door shut behind him. Ferris looked at Nora. 3 years ago," she said, "Jonas Reel's unit intercepted a procurement operation. Weapons systems, specifically a line of guidance components being diverted from military contracts to a private buyer through a network of shell corporations. The operation was classified at a level that made official reporting extremely difficult. The network had penetrated into the oversight structure." "How deep?" Nora asked. "Deep enough that the 2 people who initially filed the internal report are both dead." Ferris said it flatly, as information, not drama. Reel continued gathering evidence outside official channels. "What's on that card is the documentation of the network structure, transaction records, and identification of the individuals running it." Nora kept her face even. "Meade and Vickers," she said. "Are part of the network," Ferris said. "Yes." She paused. "I've been running a parallel investigation. Reel didn't know about me. I didn't know about him until the crash." Another pause. "I don't know who arranged the crash specifically, but I know it wasn't an accident," Reel said from the bed. "I know." Ferris turned to him. "Riverbend Aviation Maintenance Contract," Reel said. "Fuel line. It was in the pre-flight checklist and it was fine. Post-flight," he stopped. There was a 40-minute window between the check and the flight. Ferris absorbed that. She took out her own phone and typed something. Then she looked at Nora. "The card," she said again. Her voice was different now, not commanding, asking. Nora looked at Real. Real looked at Ferris for a long moment, then at Nora. "Half," he said. Both women looked at him. "The card has 2 partitions," he said. "The second partition has a separate encryption key. I'll give you the first partition. The second one stays with her until I know the chain is clean." Ferris's jaw tightened slightly. "Master Chief, you said the network penetrated the oversight structure." His voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "I don't know where it stops. Neither do you. So until I do, the second key stays outside the official chain." The room was very still. Ferris looked at Nora with an expression that was complicated, not hostile, but not comfortable. "Who are you?" she said. Not the official question she'd asked earlier, the actual question. "I'm a nurse," Nora said. "At the moment." Ferris made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She stayed another 20 minutes. She made calls on a phone that was not her standard military issue, which told Nora it was a secured line outside the normal military communication structure. She was precise and efficient, and she did not pretend that the current situation was anything other than deeply abnormal, which Nora found, against her better judgment, somewhat reassuring. When Ferris left, she took the room's staff sergeant with her and posted him at the end of the corridor instead of at the door, which created a visible perimeter without making the room itself look like a secured location. It was a reasonable tactical decision. It also meant the door was no longer guarded. Nora stood in the room with Axel at her feet, and the phone in her hand and the card and the folded paper still inside her scrub top. She looked at the phone. Dio. She dialed. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. A generic recording, no name. She didn't leave a message. She disconnected. Then the phone buzzed in her hand with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, brisk and low. "Who is this and why are you on this phone?" "My name is Nora Voss. I'm a nurse at Hargrove Medical. I'm in the room with Real." A beat. "Is he alive?" "Yes." "Mead?" "He's somewhere in this building. He came into the room with a syringe. I stopped it." A longer pause. Something was happening on the other end of the line, movement, background sound that got briefly louder and then quieter. "The card," the woman said. "Tell me about the card." "I have it. Real split the access. First partition I've shared with Colonel Ferris. Second partition stays with me until... Don't share the second partition with Ferris." Nora went still. "I need you to listen to me carefully," the woman, Oakes, this had to be Oakes, said. Ferris is not compromised, but her current communications are. Her secured line has been running through a relay that Mead's people set up. She doesn't know that, which means every call she makes on it is monitored." Nora looked at the door. "The calls she just made," Nora said. "Yes." "Which means they know what she told me." "Yes." "And they know Real is awake." "Yes." "How long do I have?" "I don't know. I'm 40 minutes out from your location." A brief pause. "Don't let anyone touch the harness. Don't give the second partition to anyone. And get Real off that floor if you can. He has a fractured tibia, 3 cracked ribs, and a cardiac event less than 12 hours ago. I know what he has. I'm saying move him if you can. Mead has a contact inside the facility. We've tracked communications to a device registered to Hargrove Medical." The line went quiet. Nora was already thinking. Floor layout, elevator positions, which staff had access to which areas, who had come on shift in the last 2 hours that she didn't recognize from her 4 months of working this building. "I'll do what I can," she said. 40 minutes, Oakes said. The call ended. Nora set the phone down on the bedside table and looked at Axel and then at Real. "Oakes says Ferris's line is compromised," she said. "They know you're awake." Real absorbed that without visible reaction, which was either professional composure or the sedation still working on his ability to react, or both. "The contact inside the facility," he said. She said a device registered to Hargrove. He was quiet for a moment. "My admission paperwork," he said. "Was there a flag for next of kin on the intake form?" She didn't know. She hadn't processed his intake. "Who does your intake paperwork go to?" he asked. "Administration and the military liaison office, which Ferris has been running through a shared system with Mead and Vickers since they arrived. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something exhausted in his face that had nothing to do with the current medical situation. I need you to trust my judgment on something. Tell me what it is first. Fair, he said. The folded paper. In your pocket. Open it. She took it out. She unfolded it carefully. It was fragile, the paper weakened by water damage. The writing inside was in pencil, which had survived the water better than ink would have. Names, numbers, and a diagram that she could partially interpret and partially not. She read it through once. The second name, Reel said. She found it. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she folded the paper and put it back against her sternum, and she stood very still for a moment while she reorganized everything she thought she understood about the current situation. Because the second name on that list was Harrison Polk, the chief of emergency medicine at Hargrove Military Medical Center, the man who had suspended her from clinical duty at 8 in the morning, the man who had told her the dog needed to be transferred and had called her experience unverified, the man who, she now understood, had every reason to want both Reel inaccessible and anyone who had gotten close to Reel's equipment dismissed and removed. How long has he been in the network? She asked. 3 years? Reel's voice was carefully even. He processes the medical intake for military personnel. He's been flagging operational personnel for Meade's network. Pre-deployment physical records. Post-deployment intake. If someone came back with information they shouldn't have had, he stopped. She understood what he was describing without him finishing it. Medical intake as a filter. Flagging people for a network that had shown itself willing to arrange accidents. The 2 people who had filed internal reports and were now dead. He suspended me, she said. This morning. I know. He's who told Ferris' team I'd entered the trauma bay. The incident report would have gone through his office automatically. Yes. She thought about the 4 months she'd spent in this building, the way Polk had looked at her during the suspension conversation, not with the concern of a supervisor managing a situation, but with something more specific. She had read it as bureaucratic caution. She understood now it was something else. He had been trying to assess how much she knew. The door opened. Not Meade this time, not Ferris, Dr. Harrison Polk. He stood in the doorway in his white coat with his tablet under his arm, and he looked at Nora and at Axel and at Jonas Reel, and his expression had none of the administrative authority of this morning. It had been replaced by something much simpler and more dangerous. Voss, he said, I need you to come with me. Axel was on his feet before Polk finished the sentence. Reel's hand moved to the call button on his bed rail. Polk looked at the call button. He looked at Nora. If you press that, he said to Reel, I will have this patient declared clinically unstable and have him transferred to a restricted unit before your You'll do what? The voice came from behind Polk. Polk turned. In the doorway behind him stood Margaret Keene, and beside Keene was the Staff Sergeant Holloway. And behind Holloway was a woman in civilian clothes that Nora had never seen before. Mid-40s, short, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent a career being underestimated and had made a professional discipline out of it. The woman held up credentials. Warrant Officer Delia Oakes, she said, Office of Special Investigations. She looked at Polk. Dr. Polk, I need you to step away from that door. Polk went very still. I made it in 32 minutes, Oakes said, looking past Polk to Nora. Traffic was light. Polk turned back to Nora, and she saw it. The precise moment when a person's calculation shifts from strategy to desperation. He moved fast for a man his age, faster than she would have predicted, cutting sideways toward the chair where the tactical harness sat, and Nora moved at the same moment, and they reached it simultaneously. His hand closed on the harness. Her hand closed on his wrist. Axel hit the floor with his full weight between them and the door, not attacking, blocking. His training still operating, still proportionate, still under control in the way that these animals were when they were functioning at their best. Polk looked down at the dog. He looked at Nora's hand on his wrist. He looked at Oakes in the doorway with her credentials still extended. And then, very slowly, he let go of the harness. The room held its breath. Keene moved first. She stepped past Oakes and past Polk, walked to the bedside, and picked up the call button from beside Reel's hand. She pressed it, setting the nursing station alert without a word, and set it back down with the precision of someone who had decided what she was doing and was doing it completely. Sergeant Holloway, Oakes said. Please ensure Dr. Polk stays in this corridor. Holloway put a hand on Polk's arm. Polk didn't resist. He stood in the doorway with his tablet under his other arm, and his face had gone to something that was no longer strategy or desperation. It was simply the blank, diminished look of a man who has run out of moves. Nora exhaled. She was still holding the harness. Oakes came into the room and closed the door. She looked at Nora for a moment, a quick, thorough assessment, the kind that took 2 seconds and missed very little. You stopped the syringe, she said. Yes. And you have the second partition. Yes. Oakes nodded. She pulled a chair to Reel's bedside and sat down as if she intended to be there for a while, which Nora understood was exactly what she intended. We have a problem, Oakes said. She was looking at Reel. Meade is still in the building and Vickers hasn't been located. Ferris is in the building, and Polk's contact in network communications has been relaying this room's monitoring data for, she checked her phone, at least 2 hours. What does that mean? Nora asked. It means someone outside this building has been listening to what Jonas says in this room. Oakes set the phone down. It means whoever arranged the crash knows the card survived, and it means that whatever they send next won't be a syringe. The room was quiet. Reel looked at the ceiling, then at Axel, then, slowly, at the window that faced the building's exterior, the window that a trained person with the right equipment and the right position could use. Nora followed his gaze. The glass was standard hospital construction, not reinforced, not rated for anything beyond basic weather. On the 3rd floor. Overlooking a courtyard she had looked out at for 4 hours from the consultation room, a courtyard that connected to the maintenance access road on the building's east side, a courtyard that someone in a dark SUV with government plates could access from the street without going through the main entrance. The same courtyard. She turned to Oakes. We need to move him, she said. I know, Oakes said. Now, Nora said. I know, Oakes said again. She was already on her phone. Outside the window, in the courtyard 3 floors below, something moved. Nora saw it. Not a shape, not a person, just a change in the light along the maintenance access path, the kind of movement that registers at the edge of perception because it is designed to. She stepped to the window and looked down. The dark SUV was in the courtyard, and the driver's door was open. And there was nobody visible inside or around it, which meant whoever had been in it was already inside the building. She turned back to the room. They're already in, she said. Oakes looked up from her phone. Reel's monitor began alarming. Not a malfunction. His blood pressure had dropped, sharply and suddenly, in the way that happens when the body encounters a chemical agent it wasn't prepared for. And Nora's eyes went to his IV line, the right arm, the one she hadn't been watching for the past 40 minutes because she'd been watching everything else. And she saw it. The secondary port on the IV tubing, the one that was accessible from the corridor side of the bed without entering the room, the one that ran through the standard wall port that connected to the corridor monitoring station and that any person with a keycard and a clinical uniform could access from outside. Someone had accessed it. The medication had already been administered. Whatever it was already in him. Nora grabbed the IV line and crimped it shut and called to Keene through the door and began calculating what she had in this room and what she needed and how long the thing in his bloodstream had been circulating. And behind her, she heard Oakes speaking into the phone in a voice that had dropped to command register, and she heard Axel's alert bark, short, sharp, specific. And she did not look at the window because she did not have time to look at the window, and then she heard the glass. The glass didn't shatter. It cracked. A single vertical fracture running from the lower left corner to the frame, the specific pattern of a high-velocity impact that hadn't fully penetrated, which meant one of 2 things. The angle had been wrong, or whoever was outside had not intended to come through the window. They had intended to be heard coming through the window. A distraction. Nora understood that half a second before Oakes said it. Other side, Oakes said, already moving toward the door. They want us looking at the window. The door. Nora had the IV line crimped in her left hand and Reel's pressure was dropping on the monitor, and she could not leave the bed, could not chase whatever was coming through the door, could not do both things. And for a single terrible second, she was simply standing in the room doing the math on which problem killed someone faster. Axel solved it. He went to the door. Not through it. He positioned himself in front of it with his full weight low and forward, and when the door opened inward 3 inches, Axel's body stopped it there, and whoever was pushing from the other side was pushing against 90 pounds of trained muscle that did not move. Keen came through the door from the corridor side. She had been in the hallway. She had seen it opening. She had grabbed the exterior handle and pulled it shut again from outside, and through the small window Nora could see her leaning her full body weight against it. Oakes was already through the connecting door to the adjacent room, which was empty, which Nora had noted without noting it 3 hours ago, the way you note things in unfamiliar spaces out of habit. Nora worked. She pulled the compromised IV line free from the secondary port and capped it. She checked Reel's pressure again, 74/50, still dropping but slower now that the line was closed. Whatever had been administered, it was fast-acting, vasodilatory from the pressure profile, probably meant to look like a cardiovascular event in a patient who had already had one. Clean, documented, explainable. She needed epinephrine, and she needed it in the next 4 minutes, or the explainable cardiovascular event was going to become a real one. "There's a crash cart in the hall," she said. She said it to Axel, which was absurd, and to the room, and to Keen through the window in the door. Keen heard her. She held the door with one hand, reached sideways to the crash cart that Nora had seen parked 3 feet from the room entrance during her earlier walks through the corridor, and fed it through the gap with the specific physical ingenuity of someone improvising under pressure. The cart's corner caught the frame. Keen swore. The cart came through sideways. Nora had the epinephrine drawn in 40 seconds. She administered it at the correct dose for his body weight, which she had looked at on his chart 3 hours ago. Not because she'd expected to need it, but because she looked at patient charts the way some people read menus, automatically, completely, retaining more than was strictly necessary. His pressure bottomed at 68 and then began climbing. She watched the monitor. 68, 71, 75. Behind her, the cracked window threw a line of cold morning light across the floor. From the corridor, she heard Oakes's voice, clipped, directing someone, the specific register of a person coordinating multiple moving pieces. Then boots on the floor, more than 2 pairs, coming fast from the elevator end of the corridor. The door stopped moving against Axel's weight. Whoever had been pushing had stopped. Nora held the monitor in her peripheral vision and looked at Reel. His eyes were open. His color was bad, the gray-green of someone whose vascular system has been chemically undermined. But he was tracking the room, tracking her, tracking the monitor with a focus that told her his brain was still getting enough blood to function. "What did they give me?" he said. "Something vasodilatory, fast onset. I've countered it. How's my pressure?" "Coming up. 79 now." He exhaled. "That's something. It's enough for right now." He looked at the cracked window. The window was the distraction. "Yes." "They wanted us looking away from the door." "Yes." "They're coordinating," he said. "That's not improvised. That's a plan they already had." She knew. She'd known since Oakes said the SUV's monitoring data had been relaying for 2 hours. 2 hours was enough time to run multiple contingency plans, to position people, to establish coordination between the individual inside the building and whoever had been in the courtyard. The door opened fully. Oakes came back through it with 2 people behind her, both in civilian clothes, both with credentials visible on lanyards, both moving with the directional purpose of people who have been briefed and are executing. "Meade is in custody," Oakes said. She looked at Reel's monitor. "Vickers is not." "Vickers was the one at the door," Nora said. "Possibly." Oakes gestured to one of the people behind her, who moved immediately to the corridor-side IV port and began photographing it and the area around it without touching anything. "Where's the card?" Nora touched her sternum. "Keep it there for now," Oakes said. "We have a containment issue. Polk made a call from his personal phone before Holloway detained him. We don't know who he called or what he said." "His contact," Reel said. "Yes, which means there may be a 4th person we haven't identified." Oakes sat in the chair she'd occupied before. She put her phone on the bedside table and looked at it. "Master Chief, I need you to walk me through the crash. Everything you remember from the maintenance window forward." Reel shifted on the bed. Nora adjusted his pillow without being asked. He was listing slightly to his right, compensating for the rib pain on his left, and the angle was going to put strain on his neck in 20 minutes. He glanced at her. "Thank you," he said. It was not a formal acknowledgement. It was just 2 words said by a person who meant them, which was different. He told Oakes about the crash. Nora listened and worked, monitoring his pressure every 3 minutes, checking the IV setup for the replacement line she was running through the left arm, watching the window and the door in alternation. She had become part of the room's operational fabric in a way that nobody had explicitly authorized, which she recognized as the pattern of this entire day. The story Reel told was detailed and careful, and came out in the flat, reportorial tone of someone who had spent years learning to separate what they observed from what they concluded. 40-minute window between pre-flight check and departure. Fuel line on the secondary system had been accessed. He hadn't known that until after, but there were physical indicators that the post-crash investigative team would have found if they'd been given access before the military liaison team arrived and restricted the site. The secondary pilot had died on impact, not from the crash itself, from a mechanical failure in his harness system that should not have been possible given the harness's inspection record. Two things failing simultaneously in a 40-minute window. Who had access to the aircraft during that window? Oakes asked. Officially, 2 maintenance staff and the ground crew lead. He paused. But the maintenance log showed a third access, personnel code that resolved to a temporary contract ID, which should not have existed for that aircraft on that date. Contract through which agency? That's what was on the card, he said. The first partition, the procurement network's contract structure, the shell corporations, the payment routing. 3 of the shells route through a defense contracting company called Meridian Logistical. Meridian has a maintenance subcontract with the aviation unit that operated that helicopter. Oakes was very still. Meridian, she said. Yes. Meridian has a federal oversight audit scheduled for next month, Oakes said. A clean audit would have locked in a contract renewal worth $430 million over 7 years, Reel said. I know. It's in the documentation. Oakes picked up her phone. She made a call that lasted 90 seconds. She said very little during those 90 seconds. She gave a company name, a contract number, and a single phrase that Nora didn't fully parse, but that produced an audible response from the other end of the line. When she hung up, she looked at Reel. The audit gets frozen pending investigation, she said, as of this call. $430 million in contract renewal. Nora thought about the 2 dead people who had filed internal reports. She thought about a fuel line and a harness and a 40-minute window. She thought about Polk in his white coat with his tablet, 3 years of medical intake data, flagging operational personnel. She thought about what $430 million was worth in terms of how far a network would go to protect itself. She thought about the sniper on the ambulance roof at 5 in the morning, aimed at a dog. The network had been very willing to cut losses. Vickers, Nora said. Oakes looked at her. He's still in the building. He knows Meade is detained. He knows the audit is being frozen. Or he will know, because whatever Polk communicated to his contact in the last... She checked the clock on the wall. 22 minutes will have propagated. Yes, Oakes said. So what does Vickers do when he knows the network is compromised? Oakes said nothing. He tries to destroy the evidence, Nora said. The card, the paper, and the person who can testify to the chain of custody. Which is you, Oakes said. And Reel. And Keene, Nora thought, who had held the door. And Holloway, who had watched. And everyone else who had been in this room during the last 3 hours. Oakes stood. I'm going to need you to stay in this room, both of you. I have people in the corridor, and I'm going to... Vickers won't come back to the corridor, Nora said. He tried that. He's going to come from somewhere that isn't the corridor. Oakes looked at the cracked window. The courtyard connects to the maintenance road, Nora said. The maintenance road runs under the building on the east side. There's an access tunnel for utility equipment. I walked through it on my second day here because I got lost looking for the records annex. She paused. It comes up inside the building through a utility access point on the second floor. The second floor connects to the stairwell. The stairwell comes out 20 feet from this room. The room was quiet. Oakes looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite assessment, something between them, the look of someone recalibrating an estimate. You memorized the building layout in 2 days, Oakes said. 4 months, Nora said. I just started on day 2. Oakes turned to one of her people and gave instructions quickly. The person left at a pace that was faster than a walk and slower than a run. It was not fast enough. They heard it from the stairwell. Not a door, not a shout, but the specific sharp report of a firearm discharged in an enclosed concrete space which has a quality unlike any other sound, a flatness and an echo simultaneously that the body registers before the brain does. One shot, then nothing. Oakes was already moving. Nora stayed. She stayed because Real was in the bed and his pressure was at 87 and climbing, and she was not going to leave him alone in this room with a cracked window and a compromised IV port, and whatever Polk had communicated to whoever was still out there. She stayed because this was what she did. Not the other thing, the thing she'd spent years not doing. This. The room, the patient, the monitor, the decision about what you can control and what you can't. Axel pressed against her leg. She put her hand on the back of his neck. The shot had come from the stairwell. 6 minutes later, Oakes came back through the door. She had blood on her left sleeve below the elbow, from a gash that was about 3 inches long and not arterial but needed attention. "Vickers," Oakes said, "is he in custody?" She said it with a flatness that meant the custody had not been easy, and she was not going to elaborate on that in front of a patient. "My agent took a graze. She's walking." She looked at her sleeve. "This is a wall fragment. I'm fine." Nora crossed to her and looked at the wound. "You need this closed. Later. It's actively bleeding." "I know. Later." Oakes pulled her sleeve down. "The second partition. I need it now. We have a federal team 40 minutes out, and I need the full documentation package assembled before they arrive." "Real?" Nora said. Real nodded. She took the card from inside her scrub top and gave it to Oakes. Oakes gave her a look that was brief and communicative. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement. The kind exchanged between people who have been in the same difficult space and have both done what the situation required. Oakes left again. The room went quiet in the particular way of spaces that have been at the center of a great deal of activity and are now briefly empty of it. The monitors ran. The light from the cracked window had moved with the sun and was now hitting the wall above the bed in a warm stripe that had no right looking as peaceful as it did. Real was looking at the ceiling. "How long were you in?" he asked. She knew what he was asking. 7 years, she said. "What unit?" "The kind that doesn't have a name in any file you'd have access to." He accepted that. "Why did you leave?" She thought about it. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the short answer, which was incomplete, and settled on the one that was both. "Someone made a decision that I couldn't carry," she said. "Not a bad person, just a decision I didn't have the framework to live with afterward." He was quiet. "A patient?" "A patient." He didn't ask for more. She appreciated that. "The crash wasn't the first time they tried," he said after a moment. 8 months ago, there was a car accident. I was told it was a civilian driver running a red light. You don't think it was? I think the driver had a Meridian logistical contractor badge in his glove box, which I only found out because I ran the plate 6 weeks later, and the registration led me somewhere interesting." He paused. "I should have moved faster after that." "You're here," she said. "Barely." "Barely counts." He looked at her. There was something in his face that was not quite the compressed exhaustion look she'd identified earlier. It was something older than this situation. The look of a person who has been alone with a difficult thing for long enough that the aloneness has become part of the thing itself. "Axel wouldn't leave me," he said. "In the wreckage. I was unconscious. He stayed for..." He stopped. "Apparently it was a long time." "I know," she said. "That's why I went in." He looked at Axel. The dog was at the foot of the bed, sitting now, his alert posture relaxed to something closer to watchful rest. "He picked you," Real said. "He recognized me." "That's not the same thing." She didn't argue with that. The federal team arrived in 38 minutes, which was 2 minutes ahead of Oakes's estimate. They arrived in sufficient number and with sufficient documentation that the hospital's East Wing was effectively a federal site within 20 minutes of their arrival. Nora watched it happen from the corridor, the systematic, efficient establishment of a controlled perimeter, the collection of physical evidence from the IV port and the adjacent wall access point, the escorting of Garrett Meade in handcuffs past the nursing station toward the elevator, while 2 nurses and an orderly watched from the break room doorway, with expressions ranging from confusion to something approaching understanding. Polk had been in a security office on the ground floor since Holloway detained him. He was transferred to federal custody at 3:17 in the afternoon. He walked through the lobby in his white coat, still with the tablet under his arm, as if some part of his operational identity hadn't caught up yet with the situation's conclusion. Nora watched him go from the third-floor corridor window. He didn't look up. She thought about 4 months of morning briefings where he had walked past the nursing station without looking at the floor staff. She thought about the suspension conversation, his tone, the specific language, the way he had been trying to establish what she knew. She thought about the 2 dead people who had filed reports before Real, whose names were on the folded paper in her pocket. She thought about what it cost a person to do what Polk had done for 3 years. And she thought about it without any of the emotional weight she would have expected, which told her something about where she was operating today. The weight would come later. It usually did. At 4:45, Oakes found her in the corridor. The wound on Oakes's arm had been closed. Butterfly strips applied in the field, not ideal but functional. She had changed her jacket. She looked like someone who had run a complex operation and was somewhere in the middle of the administrative aftermath. "I need your formal statement," Oakes said. "Chain of custody for the card, the paper, the syringe. Everything from the moment you entered the trauma bay this morning." "I know," Nora said. "It's going to be a long statement." "I know." Oakes looked at her. "You understand that your background is going to come up. Your classification level, your unit designation. I can request sealed handling, but I can't guarantee it stays sealed through a federal prosecution." Nora had known this was coming since approximately 5:11 in the morning. "I understand," she said. "The life you've been running here was always going to end one way or another," Nora said. "It's fine." Oakes studied her. "You're calmer about this than most people would be." "I've had a long day," Nora said. "I'm conserving." Something close to a smile crossed Oakes's face. It was brief and professional, and she pulled it back quickly, but it was there. "There's one more thing," Oakes said. "The man who called the sniper this morning, the authorization to neutralize the K-9. Nora had not forgotten about that. "Meade?" she asked. "Meade made the call, but the authorization came from higher." Oakes paused. "It came from within Meridian's oversight network, which means the network had reach into the response protocol before you arrived in the building this morning, before Real's ambulance reached the entrance." Nora absorbed that. "They knew he was coming," she said. "They had a contact at the emergency dispatch level. We've been through the communications log." Oakes held her gaze. "They knew he was alive. They knew Axel was with him. And they made a calculation that eliminating the K-9 in the chaos of the trauma response would remove any chance of him alerting to evidence in the harness," Nora said. "Yes." She thought about the sniper on the roof, the angle, the rifle, the barrel lowering toward the trauma bay window. She thought about walking through that door at 5:11 in the morning with her sleeve rolled up. She thought about how close it had been. "The dispatch contact," she said, "in custody as of an hour ago." Oakes looked at her phone. "We have 4 individuals in federal custody: Meade, Vickers, Polk, and the dispatch contact. The Meridian logistical audit has been suspended pending criminal investigation. The procurement contract is frozen. The federal team is executing warrants at Meridian's primary offices in Portland and Seattle simultaneously." "The network heads," Nora said, "being identified through the documentation on the card. It will take time. These things always take time." Oakes looked at her directly. "But the evidence is clean. The chain of custody is clear. Real is alive and able to testify, and the person who secured all of that is you." A pause. "Even though nobody authorized you to." "Nobody authorized me to help the patient in the trauma bay either," Nora said. "No," Oakes said. "They actively told you not to." Nora said nothing. Oakes looked at the window at the end of the corridor. The sun was lower now, coming from the west, hitting the coast range in a way that turned the visible ridgeline amber. "Colonel Ferris wants to speak with you," Oakes said. "When you're done with my team, she's been informed about her communications relay. She's—" Another pause. "She's not having a simple afternoon." "No," Nora agreed. "She also said—" Oakes stopped, seemed to decide something. "She said to tell you that she pulled your full service record, the sealed portion. She has the authorization level." She looked at Nora. "She said it's one of the more interesting things she's read." Nora thought about the record. She knew what was in it. She had written most of it herself in field reports that nobody was supposed to read. "What did she say specifically?" Nora asked. Oakes considered. She said you spent 3 years running a classified program and never once put your own name in the commendation section, Oakes said. Even when the outcomes documented in the adjacent field reports were directly connected to your actions. The corridor was quiet. I documented what happened, Nora said. What other people did. Not what you did. I knew what I did, Nora said. I didn't need it in a file. Oakes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Go check on your patient. Statement can wait an hour." Nora went back into the room. Real was awake and upright at a 30-degree angle, which was more upright than she would have recommended, but which she was not going to argue about. Axel was on the floor beside the bed, and the dog's posture had changed over the course of the afternoon in a way that was subtle and significant. The weight was more evenly distributed, the ears slightly less forward, the constant surveillance behavior reduced to something more like ordinary watchfulness. The dog was coming down from it. She checked Real's pressure. 94/62, still low but moving in the right direction. "The network is going down," she said. "I heard some of it," he said. "The walls in this place are not as thick as they look." "Polk is in federal custody." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew about Meade and Vickers. I didn't know about Polk." "The paper told me," she said. "The one from the harness." "There were 6 names on that paper," he said. "The people inside the network that I'd identified. Polk was the one I couldn't verify. I didn't know for certain." "He was accessing military intake data through his position here," she said. 3 years. Real looked at the window. "The 2 people who filed the internal reports early on. Do you know their names?" She knew 2 of the names on the paper. She didn't know which ones corresponded to that. "Not yet," she said. He told her. She didn't recognize them. She hadn't expected to. But she held the names for a moment in the way you hold information that comes attached to irreversible consequences. Not carefully, because being careful didn't help, but with a kind of attention that acknowledged the weight. "They should be in the record," she said. "I put them in the documentation," he said. "On the card. Their names, what they filed, what happened after." A pause. "They should have someone know." "They will," she said. She checked the IV line. She looked at the monitor. She did the clinical things that were hers to do in this room, and she did them with the same attention she'd given them all day. Not perfect, because nothing today had been perfect, because nothing ever was, but careful and present and real. She was almost at the door when Real said her name. "Voss?" She turned. He was looking at her with the same focused attention he'd had when he first woke up and found her in the room, the look of someone assessing a situation accurately. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the medical part. I mean, that too. But I mean for—" He stopped. He was not, she observed, a man who found gratitude easy to articulate, which she understood. "I know what you mean," she said. She went into the corridor, and standing outside the door, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her overnight supervisor badge still on, was Margaret Keene. She had held the door for 40 minutes that morning with her body weight against the frame. She had fed a crash cart through a 6-inch gap. She had pressed the call button with the specific decisiveness of someone who had decided where she stood and was standing there. Keene looked at her. "Polk," she said. "Yes," Nora said. Keene absorbed that. Something crossed her face. Not shock, but the reconfiguration that happens when information changes the shape of a long sequence of events you thought you understood. "He reviewed my annual performance evaluations," Keene said. "For 11 years. "I know," Nora said. "He approved the staffing budget." "I know." Keene was quiet. Then she said, "I hired you." "You did?" "He approved the hire." A pause. "I wonder if he knew about your background." Nora had thought about that. She had thought about it during the 4 hours in the consultation room. There were 2 possibilities. Polk had known and had kept her close to monitor her, or Polk had not known, and her presence today had been a genuine accident of scheduling. She didn't know which. She might never know. "Does it matter?" Nora said. Keene thought about it. "Not for today," she said. "No." She pushed off the wall and straightened. "Your suspension," she said. "I'm lifting it. Effective now." "Polk issued it," Nora said. "Polk is in federal custody," Keene said. "I'm the senior clinical supervisor on duty. The suspension is lifted." She looked at Nora with the direct, measured look she'd given her this morning over coffee, which felt like a week ago. I should have listened to you at 4:30 this morning when you said you could handle the dog. You covered for me with Polk before you knew any of this, Nora said. Because it was the right call clinically, Keene said. The patient was alive. You did that. She paused. I don't know what else you did, and I suspect I'm not going to be fully briefed on it, but I know what I saw. Nora said nothing. Keene started down the corridor toward the nurse's station. Over her shoulder, she said, If you're not giving a statement, go eat something. You haven't eaten since you came in. She was right. Nora hadn't eaten. She stood in the corridor for a moment, thinking about the next hour, the statement, Ferris, what came after Ferris. She thought about the sealed service record and the commendation section with no entries and the 7 years of work that existed in other people's reports. She thought about what Reel had said. He picked you. That's not the same thing. She thought about Axel pressing his head against her chest in the trauma bay, the weight of him, the trembling that had been holding and then wasn't. She thought about the things you carry for a long time and then, on a random overnight shift in a building you didn't plan to stay in, have to set down because something more important is happening and you only have 2 hands. She went to the break room. She poured bad coffee and sat down. She took the folded paper from inside her scrub top and smoothed it on the table and looked at the 6 names one more time. And she looked at the 2 names Reel had told her, and she thought about the word documented, about what it meant to put something in a record so that it existed beyond the moment, beyond the people who were there, beyond what any individual could carry. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, different from the one Oakes had used. She answered, silence for a breath. Then a man's voice, older, with the particular precision of someone who had spent a long time choosing words carefully. Ms. Voss, he said, my name is Aldrich Bren. I'm the Deputy Inspector General for Defense Procurement. A pause. I understand you've had quite a day. Yes, she said. I want you to know that the documentation you secured has been received at the highest level of this investigation. Another pause. I also want you to know that I've been informed of your service record. She waited. There are some people, Bren said, who would like to offer you a conversation about what comes next for you professionally. I'm a nurse, she said. Yes, he said, among other things. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the folded paper. She thought about the quiet, unremarkable life she had built here, which was gone now, which had probably always been provisional, which she had known on some level was provisional, the way all constructed things are provisional. She thought about what Axel had looked like standing on Jonas Reel's chest at 4:47 in the morning, refusing every person in the room except the one who knew the right language. She thought about the word rebuilt. I'll have the conversation, she said. Good, Bren said. He gave her a time and a number and hung up. She sat in the break room with the bad coffee and the folded paper and the sound of the hospital running its normal rhythms around her, call lights, elevator chimes, the distant percussion of a nursing station handling the ordinary tragedies and recoveries of an ordinary day. Normal. She had been normal for 4 months. She looked at the paper. 6 names. 4 in custody, 2 not. She counted again. The paper had 6 names. Reel had said 6 names. Polk was 1. Meade was 1. Vickers was 1. The dispatch contact was 1. 4 in custody, 2 not. She hadn't asked Oakes about the other 2 names on the list. She pulled out her phone and called Oakes. It rang 3 times. 4. Went to voicemail. She hung up and looked at the paper again, and she thought about a network that had been running for 3 years and had reach into emergency dispatch and medical intake and federal oversight and aviation maintenance. And she thought about the 4th person Oakes had mentioned, the one Polk had called before Holloway detained him, the contact whose identity they hadn't established yet. She thought about the 2 names on the paper she hadn't told anyone yet. She thought about Bren's call. She thought about how fast it had come. 40 minutes after Oakes had the full documentation, 40 minutes after the federal team arrived, 40 minutes after the second partition had been handed over. Aldrich Bren, Deputy Inspector General for Defense Procurement. She reached for her phone again. And then the lights in the break room went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Then the emergency lighting kicked in, the low amber strips along the floor that turned the break room into something that looked like the inside of a flight corridor, all edges and no middle. Nora was already on her feet before the amber came on, phone in one hand and the folded paper in the other. her body having made the decision to move before her brain had finished processing why. Power outage. Could be anything. Could be the building's aging electrical system, which she knew from 4 months of listening to maintenance staff complain about it. Could be a tripped breaker from the load of federal equipment added to the third-floor circuit in the past 2 hours. Could be deliberate. She stood in the amber light and looked at the door and listened. The hospital hadn't gone silent. Facilities like this had too many redundant systems for a power cut to silence them. She could hear the backup generators cycling up from somewhere below, the mechanical sound of a large building switching over to secondary power. She could hear call lights on battery. She could hear voices in the corridor, staff recalibrating, and underneath all of it the steady rhythm of monitors that had never stopped because critical care equipment ran on its own isolated circuit. She dialed Oaks again, still voicemail. She pocketed the phone and went to the door. The corridor was amber and moving. Nurses, 2 of the federal agents, an orderly with a flashlight. Normal emergency lighting behavior. She clocked everyone she could see in 3 seconds and started toward the stairwell. Not running, walking with the specific pace of someone who knows where they're going and doesn't want to broadcast that they're going there fast. The stairwell door opened before she reached it. Oaks came through. She was moving quickly and she had her phone in her hand and she was looking at Nora with an expression that said she had been trying to return the call and had not been able to reach her, which told Nora the outage had also hit cell coverage in the building's lower floors. "Bren," Nora said. Oaks stopped. "He called me," Nora said, 20 minutes ago. Deputy Inspector General for Defense Procurement. He knew about the documentation. He knew about my service record. He called 40 minutes after your team arrived and said he wanted to offer me a conversation about what comes next." Oaks's expression shifted. "Bren called you directly," she said, "on an unknown number, within 40 minutes. Oaks looked at the stairwell door and at Nora. "How did he know your number?" "I don't know," Nora said. "I know that there are 2 names on that paper that nobody's in custody for yet. I know Polk made a call before Holloway detained him, and you haven't identified the contact, and I know the network had reach into federal oversight." She paused. "Is Bren on that paper?" Oaks took 3 seconds to answer. "He's not on the paper," she said carefully, "but he's in the adjacent documentation, 1 layer removed from the Meridian contracts. There's a procurement approval chain that runs through his office, which you knew before today, which I've been building a case around for 6 months," Oaks said, carefully, "because Bren has 17 years in that office and relationships that run through every level of the oversight structure. And if I move on him without an airtight chain of evidence, he walks, and the case collapses." "And now he's called me," Nora said. "Which tells me he thinks the evidence on the card implicates him directly," Oaks said. "And he's trying to establish what you know and whether you can be—" She stopped. "Managed," Nora said. "Yes." The amber light ran along the floor between them. "The power," Nora said. "Building maintenance says it's a primary circuit failure on floors 2 through 4. They're calling it an overload from the equipment we brought in." Oaks looked at her phone. "Could be accurate. Could be Bren's contact creating an access window." "Yes." Oaks was already typing. "I need you to go back to Real's room and stay there. I'm going to—" "He has 2 names from my paper that you haven't identified," Nora said. "If Bren is trying to establish what I know, it's because he thinks I know who they are. Which means he might try to talk to me before your case against him is complete." "That's a significant might," Oaks said. "I know." "Nora." Oaks said her first name for the first time all day, which registered. "Bren is not Meade or Vickers. He's not going to come at you with a syringe. He's going to come at you with 17 years of institutional authority and 3 layers of plausible deniability. And if you engage with him directly, without the right protection, you will make my case harder, not easier." "I understand," Nora said. "Do you?" "Yes." She held Oaks's gaze. "Tell me what you need from me and I'll do it that way." Oaks looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I need 48 hours to get the supporting documentation around Bren processed through a channel that his office doesn't touch. I need you to not speak to him, not respond to any further contact, and not tell anyone what's on that paper beyond what you've already shared." "And the 2 names?" "Tell me now," Nora told her. Oaks typed them into her phone without visible reaction, which was itself a reaction. The names had landed somewhere, confirmed something. "Go to Real's room," Oakes said. "I'll have someone on your floor all night." Nora went. The lights came back on at 7:22 p.m., full power, the fluorescents blinking back to life with the slightly too bright quality of systems returning from interruption. The federal equipment on the third floor cycled through its reconnection sequence. The ward settled back into its normal register. Nora sat in the chair beside Jonas Riel's bed and did not think about Aldrich Bren. She thought about Axel instead. The dog had been asleep for the past hour, genuinely asleep, the first time all day his posture had released completely. I was on his side on the floor with his legs loosely extended and his breathing deep and even, and watching him sleep was doing something to Nora's chest that she couldn't fully categorize. Relief, maybe. Or the thing that comes after relief, when the situation that required everything you had has resolved enough that the body starts sending invoices for what it cost. She was tired. Not the manageable tired of a long shift, but the bone-deep kind that comes from operating at full capacity for a sustained period in conditions that didn't allow for any margin of error. She had been at full capacity since 4:47 in the morning, and it was now past 7 in the evening, and she had eaten a cup of bad coffee and nothing else. And her hands, she noticed, had developed a very slight tremor when she held them still. She held them still anyway and watched Axel sleep. Riel was also sleeping. His pressure had stabilized at 91/64, which was low normal but trending right, and the night attending had reviewed his chart and made adjustments to his medication that Nora had reviewed and agreed with, which was outside her role technically, and which she had done anyway because the night attending was a good physician and had not objected when she'd offered her read. At 9:15, Keene came in. She brought a sandwich from the third-floor vending machine, the specific kind with processed turkey and too much mustard that Nora had eaten 3 times in 4 months during long shifts, and set it on the bedside table without comment. "Eat," Keene said. Nora ate. Keene sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together for a few minutes in the way of people who have been through a shared difficult thing and don't need to immediately process it with language. "HR is going to want a meeting," Keene said eventually. "I know." Polk handled all the disciplinary documentation. So the suspension is not only lifted, it technically doesn't exist in any file that isn't currently being reviewed by federal investigators. "I understand. Which means your employment record here is clean." Keene looked at the window. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," Nora said. Keene nodded. She stood up to leave, then stopped at the door. "For what it's worth," she said again, different emphasis. "I've been running this floor for 9 years. I've seen a lot of nurses in a lot of difficult situations." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She left. Nora finished the sandwich. She watched the monitors. She sat with the tired and the tremor and the amber memory of emergency lights on a break room floor, and she waited for morning. It came. The next 48 hours moved with the particular compressed and stretched quality of institutional aftermath. Federal investigators processed the third floor of Hargrove Military Medical Center with a thoroughness that required temporarily relocating 4 other patients and generated enough documentation to fill a record server that Oakes mentioned once and didn't elaborate on. The physical evidence from the IV port was analyzed and confirmed. The substance administered to Riel was a synthetic vasodilator not approved for clinical use, which added a charge to Vickers' list that the federal prosecutor, when Nora spoke with her briefly on the second day, described as particularly useful for the narrative clarity of the case. Nora gave her formal statement over 3 sessions totaling 11 hours. She was precise and chronological, and she did not editorialize. She described the physical evidence she had observed, the actions she had taken, the words that had been spoken. She described the harness and the card and the paper and the chain of custody for each. She described the syringe and where she had put it. She described Bren's call in detail, the number, the time, the exact language. On the third session, Oakes was present. Halfway through, Oakes received a message on her phone. She looked at it. Something in her posture changed, not dramatically, just a settling, the way a person's body registers resolution before they've articulated it. She waited until Nora had finished before she said anything. "Bren was detained this morning," she said, "at his home in Virginia. Warrant was executed at 6 a.m. The federal prosecutor, who had been taking notes, stopped taking notes and looked at Oakes. "The supporting documentation cleared the clean channel overnight," Oakes said. His name appears in the procurement approval chain on 11 separate Meridian transactions over 3 years. 2 of those transactions corresponded directly with the dates of the 2 internal reports that preceded the deaths. She set her phone down. His office had clearance to access emergency communications routing in federal facilities, which explains the dispatch contact and the power interruption. Nora absorbed that. He arranged both, she said. The evidence indicates that, yes. The call to me, Nora said, was recorded, Oakes said. From our end. The moment you told me about it, I flagged it and had his communications pulled retroactively. He made 7 calls in the 40 minutes after the federal team arrived at Hargrove. Yours was the 5th. A pause. The 6th was to a lawyer. And the 7th? To Polk's personal phone, Oakes said, which Polk no longer had access to because Holloway had it. She looked at Nora directly. Bren thought Polk was still operational. He didn't know about the detention. Nora thought about that. She thought about the gap in information. Bren calling Polk's number expecting coordination and reaching a detained phone sitting in an evidence bag in a hospital security office. She thought about what that call would have said, what instructions it would have given, and how those instructions now constituted evidence. The lawyer call, the federal prosecutor said carefully, came after the Polk call. Yes, Oakes said. The prosecutor wrote something down. Nora looked at the window. Outside, Hargrove was doing what coastal Oregon mornings did. Low cloud, the light coming through it pale and diffuse, everything looking like it was still deciding whether to commit to the day. She had looked at this view for 4 months and found it either calming or bleak, depending on her mood. And today she found it neither. She found it simply present, which was its own category. The 2 names from the paper, she said. Both in custody as of yesterday afternoon, Oakes said. One was a contracting officer in the Portland Federal Building. The other was Meridian's chief operations officer. She paused. The COO's financial records go back to the beginning of the procurement diversion. He built the shell structure. He's cooperating. In exchange for something, Oakes said. That's above my level. 6 names on the paper, 6 individuals in custody. The network that had arranged a helicopter crash, 2 homicides dressed as accidents, a syringe in a compromised IV line, a power interruption, and a sniper on a hospital roof. All of it now in the documented possession of a federal prosecution team with a cooperating witness and a full chain of custody running back to a micro SD card that had ridden through a burning helicopter wreckage in the pocket of a military K-9's tactical harness. Because a dog had refused to leave. Because a nurse had rolled up her sleeve. Because some things, it turned out, could not be managed or neutralized or suspended into irrelevance. Nora signed her statement. She walked out of the interview room into the 3rd-floor corridor and stood at the window and looked at the pale morning, and she thought about the 7 years she had spent doing work that had no commendation section, and she thought about the 4 months she had spent building a life that was small and careful and deliberate, and she thought about 4:47 in the morning and a dog on a dead man's chest and the specific way certainty arrives, not as a decision, but as a recognition. She had known, in the trauma bay. Not that she would succeed, not that it would go the way it went, just that she was the only person in the building who could read what was actually happening, and that reading it and doing nothing was not something she was capable of, which was the same thing that had made the 7 years possible and the leaving necessary, and the 4 months of careful smallness always slightly provisional. She was who she was. That was neither a comfort nor a problem. It was just a fact. Reel was discharged from the ICU on the 8th day. He moved to a step-down room on the 2nd floor, and then, after another 5 days, to an outpatient recovery program. His tibia required surgical repair. His ribs required time. His heart required monitoring for 6 weeks, which the cardiologist framed as precautionary and which Reel accepted without visible frustration, which told Nora more about how exhausted he actually was than anything else would have. Axel was officially designated as temporarily assigned to Hargrove's property for the duration of Reel's inpatient stay, a bureaucratic accommodation that Oakes had arranged through a channel that Nora didn't ask about. He ate in the room, he slept beside the bed. He accepted attention from the nursing staff with a tolerant dignity that several of them found deeply endearing and that Nora found quietly correct. She visited every day. Not because she was assigned to his floor, she wasn't. Because she went. They talked, the way people talk when they have been through a difficult shared thing and are now in the ordinary space after it. About the recovery process, which was non-linear and frustrating. About Axel, who had his own set of stress responses that were resolving more slowly than Real would have liked. About the investigation, which Oakes updated them on periodically, in communications that were brief and precise, and that painted a picture of institutional accountability moving forward with the slow, grinding certainty of a process that had sufficient evidence to be unstoppable. Bren's arraignment was covered by 3 national outlets. The coverage described the Meridian logistical case in terms of a procurement fraud network, which it was, and a conspiracy against military personnel, which it also was. It described $430 million in frozen contracts and 6 individuals in federal custody. It described the evidence trail beginning with a classified military operation and ending with documentation secured at a military medical facility in Hargrove, Oregon. It did not name Nora. Oakes had arranged that. Nora had not asked her to. Oakes had done it because she understood, without being told, what Nora's preference would be, which was one of the things that happened when 2 people had spent enough time in the same difficult space that they'd begun to understand each other's operational instincts. The hospital did not arrange that. On the 14th day after the crash, Hargrove Military Medical Center's administration held a staff meeting. The interim chief of medicine, a calm, efficient woman named Dr. Petra Calloway, who had been brought in from the regional system office while Polk's replacement was identified, gave a full account of the events of the morning of the incident. She described the emergency response, the patient outcome, the federal investigation, and the role that staff members had played. She was specific about Keene. She was specific about Holloway. She was specific about Nora. Nora sat in the 3rd row and looked at the projection screen and felt the particular discomfort of being accurate when you have spent a significant portion of your adult life being deliberately inaccurate about yourself in institutional settings. Calloway described the suspension Polk had issued. She described it as unwarranted. She described it as retaliatory, a word that landed in the room with a weight that produced a visible shift in the assembled staff, because it was a direct institutional acknowledgement, on record, in front of everyone. Then Calloway said, "Nurse Voss entered a secured trauma bay against direct instructions and saved a patient's life. She then secured evidence that led to the prosecution of a federal corruption network that had been operating for 3 years. She did both of these things without authorization, without support, and without recognition." A pause. This institution intends to correct the last of those 3. Nora received a formal commendation from Hargrove Military Medical Center, which she accepted because declining it would have been more complicated than accepting it. And also, she had decided, because this time she was going to let the record say what had actually happened. Oakes was in the back of the room. She caught Nora's eye when the meeting ended and gave her a look that communicated several things in the efficient, compressed way that had become their shorthand. Then she moved through the crowd and stopped beside her. "Bren entered a guilty plea this morning," she said, quietly, just for Nora. "He's cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony puts the entire network structure on record." "And the 2 who died," Nora said. "Their names will be in the official prosecution record as victims of the conspiracy," Oakes said. "Their families have been notified. Real's name would be in the record. Their names would be in the record. The chain of accountability would be documented from the beginning to the end." Nora thought about what Real had said. They should have someone know. And she thought that this was what it looked like when the knowing happened through the right channels. Imperfectly and slowly, and with the weight of institutional process behind it, which was not satisfying in the way that a clean and immediate justice was satisfying, but was real in a way that clean and immediate justice almost never was. "Thank you," she said to Oakes. Oakes looked at her steadily. "You did the work. You ran the case for 6 months before I showed up." "Yes," Oakes said. "And you secured the evidence that completed it." She paused. "We both did work. That's how it went." That was how it went. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Nora drove out to the coastal range east of Hargrove. She had a day off. Calloway had mandated a week of reduced hours for staff who had been directly involved in the incident, which Nora had partly taken and partly ignored, and today she had actually taken it. She drove to a pull-off on a forest road that she had found in her 2nd month in Hargrove, one of the things she had done automatically upon arriving in a new place, mapping the edges of it, finding where the built environment ended and the other kind began. She sat on the tailgate of her car and looked at the tree line. It was cold. The Coast Range in November had a cold that was not dramatic. No ice, no wind to speak of, just a persistent, pervasive damp that settled into the spaces between things. She had a jacket that was not quite warm enough. She had not fixed that. She thought about this conversation with Bren's prosecutor from 2 days prior, in which she had been told that her testimony would be required at the federal proceedings and that this would likely require her presence in Washington, D.C. for several days, potentially weeks, over the next year. She thought about what that meant for the shape of her life, which was no longer the careful small shape of 4 months ago and had not yet resolved into a new shape. She thought about Real. He was in outpatient recovery. He walked with a cane that he had made clear was temporary, which the physical therapist had made equally clear was optimistic but not impossible. He had started doing administrative work from his recovery apartment, which Oakes had described as him being exactly who he was, and which Nora understood was accurate. He had asked her 3 days ago what she was going to do. She had told him she didn't know yet. He had nodded. He had not offered any advice, which she had appreciated. He had said, "Whatever it is, you'll be good at it," which was either a simple observation or the most compressed form of genuine confidence she had received from another person in years, and which had stayed with her in a way that simple observations usually didn't. She sat on the tailgate and breathed cold coastal air, and held the not knowing for a while without trying to resolve it, because some things needed to stay open for a moment before you closed them. She thought about the woman she had been 7 years ago, who had gone into a program with no name and done work that would not be in any public record, who had carried 7 years of operational experience into a small hospital in Oregon and tried to be just a nurse. She thought about how much of that woman had actually survived the attempt. More than she'd admitted to herself, clearly, because when the moment came, she had still known the command, still known the posture, still known that the dog was not a threat, but a partner waiting for someone who spoke the right language. You didn't stop being what you were just because you stopped doing it officially. That was the thing she had been trying to disprove for 4 months, and the thing that a single overnight shift had shown her, definitively and without ambiguity, was not disprovable. She was not broken. She was not fixed. She was not the sum of what she'd done or the sum of what she'd left behind. She was rebuilt, continuously, from whatever the situation required. And that was not a flaw or a remnant of trauma, or a thing that needed to be managed into dormancy. That was simply the structure of a person who had chosen, over and over, to go toward the hard thing instead of away from it. She got back in the car. She drove back to Hargrove. At the hospital, she stopped by the second floor. Real was at the window of his step-down room when she came in, standing with the cane, looking at the same coastal overcast she had been looking at an hour ago from the other side of the tree line. Axel was beside him, sitting, also looking out the window, which was either canine solidarity or the dog genuinely finding the view interesting, and she had stopped trying to draw a clean line between those two things. "How's the leg?" she asked. "It's a leg," he said. "How are you?" "I'm fine," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her with the direct, calibrated attention that she had come to recognize as his baseline. The look of someone who had spent years assessing situations accurately and did not turn it off in personal conversations. "That's not an answer," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't have one yet." He nodded. He looked at Axel. "He's been restless," he said. "Physical therapist says I can start short walks next week, outside." He looked at the window. "He needs to run." "You both do," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, something more private than that. "Oakes told me about Bren's plea," he said. "Yes." "And the name's in the record." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He put one hand on the window frame, steadying himself, the cane in the other. There was nothing graceful about the position. He was managing pain and limited mobility and the particular frustration of a physical person whose body was temporarily uncooperative, and he was managing all of it without pretending it wasn't there. "I spent 3 years carrying that," he said. "What's on the card? The names, the transactions, the whole structure of it. I carried it because there was nobody I could trust to hand it to without it disappearing." "I know," she said. "You've been carrying things longer than 3 years," he said. She looked at the window. "Yes," she said. You could put some of it down, he said. Not a recommendation, not advice, just a statement of possibility offered by one person to another. She thought about the 7 years and the careful, small life and the commendation section with no entries. She thought about a program with no name and a record that had been sealed and that Ferris had described as one of the more interesting things she'd read. She thought about everything she had documented for other people and had not documented for herself. I know, she said. It was not agreement. It was not refusal. It was where she was. Axel turned from the window and pushed his head against her thigh. The same gesture from the trauma bay, the same weight, the same acknowledgement that had nothing of performance in it. He was who he was, completely, in all circumstances. She put her hand on the back of his neck. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not celebrated, not vindicated in some dramatic public way, but simply seen, accurately, by the situation you were in. To have the situation reveal you as capable rather than as dangerous, as experienced rather than as insubordinate, as exactly the right person for the exact right moment, not because you'd planned it that way, but because you had spent years becoming something specific, and the world had finally needed that specific thing. She thought about the people who had dismissed her, Polk, Webb, Ferris, before she understood, every system that had looked at a young nurse on an overnight shift and seen only what was on paper. She thought about what it would have cost her to have stayed small, stayed quiet, accepted the suspension, and let Axel be shot and let Jonas Reel die in a trauma bay that could not move because it was afraid of the animal that was the only thing keeping him alive. It would have cost everything. Some things were more expensive than staying in your lane. This had been one of them. Through the window, the cloud cover was breaking slightly, not dramatically, just a seam opening in the gray that let a strip of winter light through. The kind that doesn't warm anything but makes everything visible for a moment in clean, unambiguous detail. Nora looked at it. Then she looked at the man standing at the window with a cane he hated, and a dog who had crossed a burning wreckage to stay beside him, and she thought that this specific arrangement of imperfect surviving things was the only kind of story that was ever actually true. Not the clean version, not the version where everyone knows the right things at the right times, and the good people are clearly good, and the system works the way it's supposed to, and nobody ends up spending 14 hours in a hospital she wasn't supposed to be and doing things she wasn't authorized to do to keep alive a man she'd never met. The real version, where the dog is the first one who understands, where the most junior person in the room is the only one who can read what's happening, where the evidence rides through a fire in a canine's harness pocket because an animal made a choice that no system had programmed him to make, where a nurse rolls up her sleeve and shows an old tattoo and says 2 words in a language that only a handful of people in the world still speak, and everything turns on that, where justice is not a clean conclusion but a long documented process, grinding forward because someone stayed in the room when everyone else had a reason to leave. That version. The one where the broken things don't get repaired so much as they get rebuilt into something that knows its own structure, that knows what it can hold and what it can withstand and what it was made for, even when nobody else does yet. Nora Voss was 26 years old. She had a sealed service record and an old tattoo and a commendation from an institution whose chief of medicine was currently awaiting federal trial, and she had kept a man alive with a syringe and a stethoscope and a single sentence spoken to a dog in a language she was never supposed to still know. She did not know what came next. She knew what she was. That was enough. Come on, she said to Reel and to Axel and to the general proposition of what came after. Let's go outside. Reel looked at her. The physical therapist said next week, he said. The hallway counts, she said. It's a start. He looked at Axel. Axel was already at the door. Reel pushed off the window frame. He walked. Not well. Not without effort. Not without the cane and the slight catch in his breathing when the ribs protested and the concentrated attention of someone relearning the simple mechanics of moving through space. But forward. Steadily and imperfectly forward, which was the only direction that had ever counted. Axel walked beside him. Nora walked on the other side. The hallway was ordinary, fluorescent, institutional, smelling of antiseptic, and the specific warmth of a building full of people trying to recover. Other patients moved past them. Staff moved past them. Nobody stopped to watch. Nobody marked the moment as significant, because from the outside it looked like 3 unremarkable figures moving down a hospital corridor on a Tuesday morning, which was exactly what it was.